Welcome to this Creative Instinct podcast production made for the Cambridgeshire Recovery Service, one of a series made by people navigating their recovery journey, driven by people who have been there and recognise the way.
I wanted to tell my story because I think the circumstances that I found myself in when I stopped drinking and through the very early days of my recovery were quite unusual and quite traumatic, and it was a real test, I think, of my recovery, that knowing that those traumatic circumstances were coming up, I flipped it in my head that instead of wanting to drink to cope with it, I knew the only way I was going to cope with it was to not drink and to be in recovery. And that became one of the most important things at that time for me. And I think to show that someone can go through something really traumatic and remain sober, but not just that, but in order to cope with something really tough that life throws at you, to know that being sober is the only way that really you're going to get through it relatively okay, I think I hope that might give hope to other people. It was all such a blur at the beginning of my recovery. I think for most people it is anyway. Because usually things for me, push things too far, things got to a head, something had to change. I definitely got to the point where I had to stop, but I was coming in kicking and screaming still because I'm stubborn, which I think a lot of people can relate to, and if someone tells me not to do something, it makes me want to do it more. But I was very unwell. At the time, both mentally and physically, I was unwell and I wasn't coping with life really at all. And then 5 days after I stopped drinking, kicking and screaming, my husband got diagnosed with terminal cancer. So I knew at that point that actually life was going to get pretty difficult. I was going to be his carer. We knew what was going to happen. We always had hope. We always had humour. We really made the most of the time that we had. We took a lot of advice, particularly with our kids, and we became a real unit. But part of that, even though there was so much going on, because he was so poorly, and obviously we had the kids and there was so much to think about, but my recovery became one of the most important things because I could not do any of the things I absolutely needed to do. And I don't like that as well. You should do this, you need to do that, you have to do that. But I wanted to. You know, I love my husband, I love my children, and I wanted to be there for them at this really difficult time. And so I was doing that for me because that's what I wanted to do. And I knew the only way I could do that was to be in recovery. But not just be in recovery, but to really look at myself and actually start looking after myself for the first time in a long time. I think we all get to the point where we don't think we're very important. I didn't think I was very important. I thought, you know, my husband would just look after us all. Everything would be okay. But then, you know, we found out that it wasn't. And I don't know why it took that, but I think at the beginning of recovery, for a lot of people, it's important to realise that you're worth something. I obviously felt like I had to stay sober for a lot of other people, as we all do. But then I realised that it was the only way I could kind of feel at peace, so I was doing that for myself. And I think I realised that a few months into my recovery, the more groups I went to, the more that I took from every single person that shared in the group and everyone's experience, and thinking, you know, it's that sense of community. You're not the only one. You're not the only one that has decided to cope with life with the tools that you already had, which was oblivion in the end. And then all of a sudden these problems that you didn't realise you had, that you were numbing for ages, all of a sudden you start realising what was really going on, and you can start actually doing something about it rather than everything just getting worse. And there were things at the beginning of my recovery that I didn't even realise were wrong, or that was making me sad, or that was making me deeply unhappy in my life. And that was why I was drinking. It was only when I stopped that all those things started to fall into place. Like, maybe that's wrong, maybe that relationship is wrong, maybe I haven't set my boundaries right there, maybe I'm resentful for this reason. And actually that's really empowering, and it's that sense of empowerment that I think was a real turning point for me in my recovery, because I wasn't feeling helpless. I think in the situation it'd be easy to feel like that, to feel like the victim, to feel helpless. I have to do this. My husband's ill, my husband's going to die, I have to do this whether I like it or not. But I didn't feel like that, because I felt like all of a sudden I was worth something, and I was incredibly important, and not only to my friends and family but to myself, and that actually I could possibly be happy in the worst circumstances. You know, we did find happiness in those places, and I definitely wouldn't have done had I been drinking. If I had been coping with life like I was while Mike was really ill, I think it would have just been so hard for everyone, but particularly selfishly myself. It would have been awful, and then I'd feel guilty, and we all know how it feels to feel guilty, feel terrible, and then what do? We want to feel better, so then we use again, which is the cycle I think a lot of people can relate to. I think being so open and so honest and authentic was so refreshing at the beginning of my recovery, and I felt like deep down I've always been like that, but I was masking myself or hiding things for years, hiding my behaviours because deep down I was ashamed of it. And all of a sudden I could just be completely myself with no judgment, and that's why I volunteer now, and that's why I surround myself with people in recovery, because there is just no judgment. There is empathy, there is interest, and there's always interest. Like my brain now, I interest myself. My behaviours now, it interests me, and then I can openly talk to people about it and say, isn't it interesting that that made me really angry the other day? Or isn't it interesting that that triggered me to actually think, oh, maybe I would like a drink? Or isn't it interesting that, you know, and that authenticity, I think I always wanted that, and I always thought that that's what I was when I'd had a drink, you know. I was all chatty and I was all open, but I wasn't myself at all. And then to all of a sudden be able to just be myself with no judgment was incredibly refreshing, and that's why I surround myself with people in recovery now, because I am just completely myself. I think I try to feel pride in myself, but it's really hard. I think it's something that you have to work on. I certainly do. I think there's the cynical part of my brain that thinks, well, don't get too ahead of yourself, because things could come crashing down very quickly. So I think I try to sometimes. The other day I was driving in the car and thinking about something, and I actually patted myself on the back about something. But I still doubt myself all the time. I still have the same thoughts as when I was drinking, but I just let them come and go, and I embrace them now, and I find them interesting. I don't judge them now. I don't judge myself for getting upset. I don't judge myself for getting angry. I try and think, oh, isn't that interesting? all the reasons that I'm doing it, because they're for me and for my own peace and inner peace and purpose and all of the big existential things that you sometimes think about, particularly when you lose a spouse or anyone loses someone close to them. But I embrace all those thoughts now. I embrace those big questions instead of trying to numb them. And I am very self-aware, which sometimes works to my detriment because I still say silly things, but I just know that I've done it. But it's not the same as that awful feeling the next day when you're like, oh, what did I say? What did I do? I don't have, and I'm going on a tangent now, but feelings of guilt, I think I really struggle with that. I really struggle with feelings of guilt. When you've been hiding a behaviour for so long, it opens the floodgates to be more dishonest. And all of a sudden I was like, I don't have to be dishonest about anything anymore. And also our advice at the time with our children was to try and be as honest with them as possible. So I just got really used to being honest, and I really enjoyed it. With my husband being ill, and also at the beginning of the recovery when I really didn't want to do it. But then all the reasons that I wanted to drink became all the reasons why I didn't want to drink, and I realised I was doing it for myself. But that level of acceptance required a lot of work to try and accept that your husband is going to die in a few months. You know, that's a pretty big test. But it's what it has taught me is shit really does happen, right? It really does. And it's about how you react to it. And I think that knowing that does feel empowering and feels very freeing, because then you're like, well, Christ, life can literally throw anything at me, but I have all these tools, and I am really aware of myself, and I've really taken a good hard look at myself, and I've tested myself to this point. You know, I say to anyone in recovery, if you can do this, if you can stop this habit that you have gotten really, really good at, and that has probably taken a real hold of you physically and mentally, if you can stop that, you can do anything. And it's that feeling of, Christ, I can really do anything if I set my mind to it. And that is empowering, and reminding yourself that you are the one thing that you can control. You can't control life, you can't control other people, you can't change the past. There is a level of acceptance, but that doesn't mean that you're the victim, and it doesn't mean that you aren't in control, because whatever life throws at you or whatever someone says to you, you really are in control with how you react to it. And knowing that how you react to it, you're not doing that for the other person's benefit, you're doing it for yourself. Because if you get really angry and frustrated at somebody, the only person that's going to affect is yourself. And it's all those tools that I've learned in recovery that just help with life in general. But yeah, acceptance was a real test. Acceptance and feelings of guilt, and struggling with feelings of guilt and trying not to. And I know a lot of people do fellowship. It wasn't for me in my recovery. I know it helps a lot of people. I know some people it's not for them. But I think the Serenity Prayer, the concept of that is just, it really makes sense to me. You know, you've got to accept the things you can't control. You've got to be brave enough to do some things about the things that you can. So, like I say, all the things that I didn't even realise that were wrong, when I stopped drinking, I was like, oh no, I can do something about some of those things. And then having the intelligence to know the difference between the two. At the beginning of my recovery, you know, me being me, I was probably quite chatty from the start. But people, you don't have to share everything at the beginning. You can just, I took so much from the meetings that I attended by listening to everybody. And if that's all you do at the beginning, if all you do is listen to some other people in a room for 45 minutes or an hour or on a Zoom call, if you just listen to some other people and take just a tiny bit of what they shared or their experience or something that they said that resonates with you, then that's all you need to do at the beginning, I think, because eventually, and hopefully quite quickly, I think it sinks in that actually all these people are, I can really relate to all these people, and maybe I can learn something from them. And look at that person, they've managed 3 months. That's fantastic. I wish I could get to that point. I wonder how they did that. Look at that person, they're on a reduction plan. Look at that person, they actually struggle with cocaine. I don't have that, but I can really relate to some of their behaviours, and then eventually the safer you feel, the more you can share of yourself. You might, and what you put into it, I suppose, you will get out. And also patience, which sounds, it's probably the most frustrating thing to say to someone right at the beginning of their recovery. But no thing that's really, really worth doing, and recovery is really, really worth doing, is easy. If there was a pill for happiness, we'd all be taking it. There isn't. There's pills for all sorts of things that I'm sure you could probably go to the GP about, but I didn't understand any of my symptoms because I was numbing them all because I was using. And actually a lot of my anxiety just kind of quietened down as soon as I stopped drinking. And I thought when I was drinking that I was drinking to manage my anxiety, and then I realised when I stopped drinking it was that was making me so anxious, really. Or that I realised that there were certain situations making me anxious and I could do something about it. The meetings that I went to at the beginning of my recovery, because Mike was so poorly and things were changing all the time, it was a very traumatic situation over 8.5 months, and then my grief as well. But all those groups really kept me grounded. I could be myself, like you said. I felt so supported. None of those groups were for my grief or dealing with a terminally ill partner. They weren't. But I felt comfortable enough to be able to share some of what I was going through with this fantastic group of people. And I felt, I'm going to get emotional. I honestly, I felt so supported, and it was so important to me, because most people as well in recovery, no one's gone out to be an addict on purpose. No one's gone out to ruin other people's lives, let alone their own. And most people, particularly in recovery, are so good at beating themselves up, and they're just fundamentally kind people. And I now choose to surround myself with really kind people because I know how important that is. I don't think I could have coped with everything, my recovery, but also my husband being poorly and my grief, without some of the groups that I went to, genuinely. And I think for that I'm going to be grateful for a very long time.
Your story can help others, and we'd love to hear it. Wherever you've been, wherever you are, how you got there, whatever, it's up to you.